Hi, everyone. My name's Amy McDonald. I'm the director of CitySpace. You're in for a special treat this afternoon. As you know, we have NPR's All Things Considered host, Ari Shapiro, sharing stories from his recent memoir, The Best Strangers in the World, with our own All Things Considered host, Lisa Mullins. I also want to note that the music you heard in the lobby was curated by Ari to make us all feel more joyous and optimistic. We'll be taking your questions throughout the hour. Just go to, it'll be on the slide just in a moment, slido.com on your phone, #Shapiro. We'll be taking your questions throughout the hour. Without further ado, we're going to now listen to a brief compilation of stories from Ari's reporting over the years.
Here we go, pulling out into the water, into the largest mangrove forest in the world. There are going to be people listening somewhere in America who will hear that and say, "What are you, crazy?"
No, I'm not crazy. I'm just not going to subscribe to fear.
It feels like a scene out of King Kong or Jurassic Park, but we're really only 25 miles off the coast of Los Angeles.
And no dinosaurs.
No dinosaurs, as far as you know.
As far as I know.
The Mugabe era is gone, and it's something that can't be ever allowed to come back.
And is what you're trying to do here making sure that that change stays permanent?
Yes.
But I really am grateful that my heart has been broken a good many times, because it does help me to love.
Ari Shapiro, NPR News, Rio de Janeiro.
Santiago, Chile.
Belgrade, Serbia.
Izmir, Turkey.
Traveling with the president aboard Air Force One.
To them, this is just another day on the water. To me, it's a final exclamation point marking the end of my time in the UK.
Hi, everybody.
Just shows Ari is a great producer as well, even of music pieces and walk-on pieces too. So it's just multi-talented, this very, very suave guy who is gracing us right now on a Sunday afternoon between, I think yesterday was Dallas and tomorrow is...
Tomorrow
we
is
forgot.
DC.
Tomorrow is DC.
Lisa,
That's
I have to tell you,
later.
I'm having such a public radio experience right now because I've listened to you for years. And I'm now having the experience that I'm sure many of you are having with me, which is like this familiar voice that I've heard for so long that has been such a part of my life coming out of the mouth of somebody I've never met before.
And you know, and how many people hear either of our voices and think that the voice doesn't match the person? That's not you, really, honestly. So I just wanted to say, you might remember in that montage we heard Ari signing off from Air Force One. And there are so many questions that I have for Ari. You'll read these wonderful stories in the book. But it was a similar sign-off to that one that Ari writes about in the book when he was on Air Force One with Barack Obama. And this just tells you, it peels the curtain back a little bit on what it's like to be a reporter on deadline when you have to file something. Now, it's not a life and death emergency, but you really want to make your deadline and you feel like it's your life or your death that's you know, basically riding on the line in your storytelling. Just tell us that story to begin with.
Well, the story that I tell in the book about filing aboard Air Force One took place in the bathroom. And actually, Lisa asked before we came on, was that aboard Air Force One, the one that you were recording in the bathroom? And the truth is, I don't know, because I did not say Ari Shapiro, NPR News, traveling with the president in the bathroom
with
of
the
Air Force One.
toilet flush behind you.
I left that to, you know, be revealed in the memoir many years later. But that particular trip was a sort of surprise, unannounced trip into a war zone. We went to Afghanistan, and we had 3 hours on the ground in Afghanistan, and then we were scheduled to refuel at Ramstein Air Base in Germany, during which time I was going to file the story for Weekend Edition Saturday about the surprise, unannounced trip, and then it was going to be broadcast while we were in the air between Germany and Washington, D.C., and we were scheduled to have 30 minutes on the ground, and according to the clock, I still had some time left. I was in the bathroom recording my tracks, sitting on the toilet lid, because it was the only quiet place on the airplane that I could find. And as I was sitting there, I started to feel this rumbling and realized that Air Force One was rocketing down the runway, and I hadn't yet filed my story. And so I tried not to let the panic in my voice. I finished recording my tracks. I burst out of the bathroom, plugged my recorder back into my laptop, and desperately uploaded my recording and made it just before we hit the clouds and lost connectivity for the rest of the trip.
And then Ari sits back and orders a gin and tonic.
Yes. It was a stressful trip. I had earned a drink.
Or two. So, taken from those heights, now I just want to go back to where it all began in Fargo, North Dakota.
Yeah.
And this too is in the book. And I wonder if you can just take us through, say, your first 14, 15 years quickly.
Yeah, so I was born in North Dakota. My parents both taught at NDSU, and I was the only Jewish kid in my elementary school besides my older brother. And so every December, he and I would go from classroom to classroom with a menorah and a dreidel, explaining what Hanukkah was. And then, when I was 8, we moved to Portland, Oregon. And at the age of 16, I came out of the closet, and I was, once again, sort of the only out gay person in my high school. And I was not trying to conceal it at all. I put a pink triangle pin on my backpack. I plastered my locker with, gay erotica. I dressed in drag for Halloween. And so once again, I found myself in this position of taking something that people might have heard about in the abstract and might have had opinions about in the abstract and making it real to them and saying well, if you think you have opinions about this concept, I'm the person that you can plug into that conceptual idea. And what I realized was that I was building these skills of sort of boundary crossing and walking between worlds and almost being an ambassador to the unfamiliar. And I discovered that as a journalist, I could do that same thing with groups that I had no personal connection to beyond my curiosity. And so I often feel like the headset and microphone that I carry are almost like a snorkel and mask that let me explore hidden worlds that I would not have access to otherwise, and then I get to share those worlds with all of you.
I have to say, it was, I think, brave of you to come out at 16 when nobody else was coming out and doing it in a very visible way. And at a time, and I think many of you will recognize this as well, when, you were pretty young, but to you still, saying that you're gay meant saying you're going to have a short life, because this is a time when you were everywhere, people were talking about AIDS.
Yeah, people told me that they expect... So now, when I came out, I never even kissed a boy. It wasn't that I was living a double life. But people told me that they expected the next words out of my mouth after I'm gay to be, and I have AIDS. Because those were the only gay stories that the public really had access to at that point. I remember the movie Philadelphia, which won the best Oscar. In the first draft of my chapter where I write about this, I say I didn't need Tom Hanks weeping along to a Maria Callas aria to remind me that gay stories end in tragedy. And my editor, to his credit, was like, I know it feels right now like nobody's going to read these words you're writing, but eventually people will, and I think maybe you can make this point without name-checking Tom Hanks. So I have no beef with Tom Hanks, and as you read the book, you will not find his name anywhere in it, but now you know, reading between the lines, that was the sentiment.
So in terms of where you come from and how that has played a part in what you do right now, I think in the words of your mom, when she was entertaining people at home, Ari has 2 brothers, and you're the middle child, which might say a lot. And tell us how she introduced you.
So this is actually at my grandmother's 90th birthday party. Each of my grandmother's children were introducing their nuclear families. And my mother said, well, there's Dan, the older one, there's Joseph, the younger one. She gave a little description of each of them. And then she said, and then there's my middle child, Ari, who was so ignored as the middle child that he had to find a job where millions of people would pay attention to him every day. And I was actually stunned. Not because I thought she was wrong, but because I truly never thought of it in those terms. And I was like, wow, is that the key to why I do everything I do? I don't think it is, but there's a grain of truth perhaps there.
Yeah, I would say so, because especially when you look at what you do for a vocation, and I don't know if you can call music an avocation, but maybe
Yeah.
you can tell
Yeah,
our
so
audience.
as some of you may know, I also sing with a band called Pink Martini. Based in Portland, Oregon. They tour the world. They have more than a dozen people. They're like a little orchestra. We come to Boston at least once a year. The band leader and lead singer, Thomas Lauderdale and China Forbes, met here in the Boston area when they were undergrads at Harvard. And I also do a show with the actor Alan Cumming, which he and I did at Symphony Hall not too long ago. And so he and I do this cabaret show where we sing songs and tell jokes and share stories and hopefully entertain the audience as much as we entertain each other. So those are the two things I use my vacation time to do when I'm not out reporting on the news or hosting All Things Considered.
And writing a book.
And writing a book, too.
Yeah, pretty amazing. How many people, by the way, have seen Pink Martini or Alan Cumming and Ari? Really amazing. And who knows how you fit all of this in. And Ari's married and has a great dog. What's the dog's name?
Two of them, Bruce and Simone.
Oh. We saw pictures because his husband is
Yes.
texting him pictures right now. So, by the way, I think it says if you want to ask a question of Ari is, as I think Amy said, going to have to take off right after this because he has an appointment after this. But if you have a question for him that you want to ask
Now is your chance.
now is the chance to ask him anything. Go to, I think it says slide.do and enter Shapiro, and we'll
This
get
is
him as
amazing.
many
I've never
questions
seen
as
this
we can.
platform. I'm excited.
Yeah, it's actually quite good, and it saves us from having to move the microphone around.
Also saves you from this is more of a comment than a question.
Yes,
folks.
yeah,
None of
exactly.
whom I'm sure are here in this audience, but in other cities, you know.
So let me just see. Okay, so you can submit your questions anytime you like. So I want to ask you a little bit about, okay, let's go with the theme here of when you started at NPR and you got an internship with none other than Nina Totenberg.
Well, I was first rejected for an internship at NPR, let's be clear. So if anyone ever feels like they're a failure, remember, NPR's Ari Shapiro was rejected for an NPR internship.
So how'd you eventually get it?
Well, Nina hires her own interns, separate from the whole NPR internship
And
program.
Ari finds this out, which not everybody would.
You know, as an investigative reporter, as a dogged journalist.
That's right.
You can't, but just generally in life, like failure is not the end. Failure is a step on the path. And what we don't succeed at teaches us and helps us learn in ways that will help us eventually succeed. And so, yeah, I was rejected for an NPR internship. And then, you know, I remember I reached out to Susan Stamberg, actually, as a middle step along the way that I don't write in here. She very kindly returned my phone call and sort of had a chat with me. She suggested I try applying to the Kitchen Sisters, who are these legendary independent radio producers. I reached out to them. They said we don't take interns, although one of them, Davia Nelson, is going to be playing the role of Lisa Mullins in my San Francisco book event. So that's really wonderful.
Excellent.
She's agreed to be my moderator out there. So the point is, you know, things not working out is a step along the way, even for people who ultimately land in a position that seems like they have achieved the pinnacle. Like things don't work out along the way.
Right. So it really worked out for you because even after Nina, you went on to more great things at NPR. And tell us about your next assignment in London.
Yeah, well, so, you know, I interned for Nina, and I wasn't immediately an international correspondent right thereafter, but, you know, I covered the Justice Department and the White House, and after about 4 years on the White House beat, I went to London to join our international desk. I was there for close to 2 years, and there were a couple things that I really loved about that job. One is that being based in London gave me an opportunity to be as omnivorous as I am hosting All Things Considered.
Because
So-
your base is London, but you travel elsewhere.
Yeah, well, the second thing was that I was able to travel everywhere. But even in London, I was able to do stories about arts, business, science, politics, sports. Well, okay, I didn't do that many sports stories. And the other thing is that from London, I was able to go truly all over the world and have experiences that changed my life. I mean, if you consider the fact that I was in London for less than 2 years, and yet stories that I told during that 2-year period make up not the majority, but a disproportionate amount of space in this book, I think you begin to appreciate how formative that position was for me.
Question from the audience. Where have you traveled for work that you would want to go back to for fun, and why?
Okay, this is going to be an answer that I think will surprise many of you, but northern Iraq, the city of Erbil in the Kurdish region of Iraq, is such an incredible place. It's safe there. You could go as a tourist. It has what may be the oldest continuously inhabited site in the world, which is the Citadel at the center of Erbil. The surrounding area is just so full of historical, archaeological sites, sites that are full of religious history. The food is some of the best food I've ever eaten. I bought an antique Iraqi rug there that now sits in my office. It's a spectacular destination that I don't think is on the tourist map at all, but there's no reason it shouldn't be. And so if you're looking for your next vacation, I say Northern Iraq.
Which nobody else has said so far. So let's talk about that in Iraq. In 2015, you spent, this is really one of your magnificent stories. I think many people might remember it. You spent a day with counselors and therapists and traumatized patients at a clinic that was run by International Medical Corps. And there is a man who you always remember. He had a 7-year-old son who was killed right in front of him. Now, the question I have here has to do with the not just the reporting that you do, but the craft of writing a story, because I think for a lot of people, I mean, we certainly have many people who work with us and we rely on for fixing interviews, lining up interviews, for helping us with writing, editing, everything. But your job is to create a story of the truth of what's happening. And creating a story, for any of you who are writers, is very difficult. So tell us about this man. I want to hear the end of this interview. We're going to be hearing a little bit of a clip, but first tell us how you were going to end the story with him.
Well, I think it's worth describing something a little more general that I always try to do in stories, particularly when they're about very distant places, experiences that may seem far removed from our own lives, which is that I'm always looking for some relatable, universal moment that a listener who is cooking dinner or picking up their kids from school or whatever the case may be can latch onto and connect with and say, oh, that's not so different from my own life. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, when I'm in an internally displaced persons camp and I'm talking to people who have experienced atrocities of war in a country that most of our listeners have never visited and will never visit, the challenge is like, how do I find the thing that people can connect to? And so I didn't have a ton of experience reporting in the Mideast. We have correspondents who have built their career on Mideast reporting, and they know the kind of like the cliches, the things to avoid, the things that are overused. I did not. And so when I wrote the first draft of the story, I ended with this man saying, and he was one of several characters in the story, you know, he said that when he arrived at this place, he was 90% pain, and now he was 50% pain. And the whole piece was about kind of like the mental health professionals who were working in these camps. And so I said, you know, could you imagine a time when you were like 10 or 5%
This is actually,
pain?
do you want to hear the clip?
Sure.
Okay, Stephen, can we play the clip?
Was that your son? Is that his photograph on your phone? Oh, he's adorable. He's so young and smiley.
The man scrolls through the images. His son is a newborn, as a toddler. He says he looks at these more times each day than he can count.
You said that before you were 90% pain, and now you're only 50% pain. Can you imagine a day when 50% is 5% or 0%?
God willing, he says. At the end of the day, we leave the camp and pass by this man again. He doesn't notice us. He's sitting by himself, staring at the pictures on his phone. Ari Shapiro, NPR News, Erbil, Iraq.
It's a beautiful ending, and it wasn't originally written that way.
Yeah, so originally I ended with inshallah, and
to answer the question,
yeah,
can you imagine?
And it's like, God willing. And I sent the draft to my editor in Washington, Larry Kaplow, who's a very experienced Mideast editor, and he was like, inshallah is a bit of a cliche. Like, every story from the Mideast begins with the call to prayer from the mosque and ends with inshallah. Not every story, but every cliche, archetypal, stereotypical story. So he was like, can we come up with a better ending? And so I went back through the memories I had, and I thought, well, this moment of sort of scrolling through the pictures on his phone and being so engrossed that he didn't see the person walking by. That's something we've all experienced, even if we haven't had a tragedy comparable to his. And so I thought that last moment of not noticing somebody because you're so engrossed with your phone both speaks to who and where he is, and also to something universal that we could all connect with no matter where we're experiencing his story.
And it's one of the also one of the things to remember, we're told to remember as reporters, is when you have so much input, when there's so much coming into you and you're trying to make sense of things, especially in a foreign place, a place you're not familiar with, what you need to do is think of what you would tell your partner, what you would tell your child or mom or dad, and then remember that's probably what the audience wants to hear. And that's what you
This
did.
is a good rule of thumb that, like, if you're leaving a day of reporting, call your editor or your spouse or your friend or your producer and tell them about your day. And don't do it in the mindset of I'm reporting the story. Do it in the mindset of I'm telling you about what happened today and what I saw. And those details should, in most cases, make it into the piece that you ultimately write and file, because those are the details that stood out to you in your experience. They're what listeners will connect with as well.
One of the things that I liked about that little clip is that, and I notice this in a lot of your reporting, is that you're very present and you're not asking that kind of question that you asked of him about 10%, 5% in an automatic way. I mean, you asked it as a human being. And this gets me to the next question from the audience. Have many or any stories made you cry? I don't know if that means as you're hearing it back or as you're writing it, as you're reporting it, but...
Yeah, I want to answer that question and also speak to something you're identifying, which is that the act of reporting can sometimes be viewed as almost vampiric, like you're taking something from people and making a paycheck off of it. But I think the act of listening can be very therapeutic. I think it can be healing. I think it can be a service that we give. And so when we are
therapeutic for you
for the person
and
who
the person
is telling their story,
Yeah.
I think it can be difficult to go to a place where somebody is experiencing the worst day of their lives, whether that's a natural disaster or a mass shooting or a war zone. And it can be painful to walk up to them and say, will you tell me about what happened? And oftentimes they don't want to, which I respect. But there are many people who really do want to talk and really do want someone to listen. And in those cases, I think the act of really listening to somebody can be a gift. And if it is really listening to somebody in pursuit of a story that I will go on to report, it allows me to feel less like I am taking advantage of a situation in order to do my job, and more like I'm actually playing a valuable role here that may help the person who is sharing their story with me, who might not have had somebody there to listen to it if I hadn't been there. So then, to answer the listener's question about has a story ever made me cry, there's a strange phenomenon that I think many reporters experience, which is when I'm in the moment and I'm doing the interview, and even later when I'm listening back to the tape and writing the piece, I am totally fixated on what I'm doing in that moment. So I'm listening, I am writing, I'm recording, I'm very, very present. And I have never actually been brought to tears as I'm doing an interview. But later, when I'm sitting in my hotel room or at home and I hear the story air and I'm sitting on the outside of it, that's when the emotions come. And I'm sure some psychiatrist could give an explanation for why that is, but it's consistent enough that I now recognize that as a pattern. And I think other journalists experience that as well, that like when you're doing the job, you're doing the job. And then when the story is airing and you're listening to it, you can have that aesthetic distance and have an emotional reaction to it.
I think because of your interest in tapping sources that will illuminate an issue, no matter if it's war crisis, refugee crisis, whatever it happens to be, to illuminate for a listener, that's what brought you to a man who was a refugee from Syria. You met him in Turkey, and what you decided to do was to follow one person's story over a long period of time. So, I mean, we get in this position where you feel like it's kind of a hit and run, like, here, tell me about your trauma. Okay, I'm going to make a story, goodbye. And you really wanted to stay away from that in terms of the refugee crisis. Can you tell us about that?
I only had about a week to report from coastal Turkey, and at that point, the story of the Syrian refugee crisis was in the news every single day. And I wanted to find a way to cut through the noise and tell a story that people would remember. And so I decided to follow one person's story, not knowing how long we would continue this or how it would end. And I enlisted my colleagues who were correspondents across Europe, because I met him in coastal Turkey as he was trying to get to Greece. His ultimate goal was to get to Germany and then hopefully reunite with his family. And so I told the first part of his story from the city of Izmir and then the city of Bodrum, Turkey, and then Joanna Kakissis, who is now our correspondent based in Kiev, Ukraine, she met him in Greece and then passed the baton to Eleanor Beardsley, who met up with him in other countries and finally reached him in Germany, where he arrived. But even then, the fight wasn't over because his wife and children were still in Syria, and he had to struggle to bring them over to Germany, which was far more difficult than he expected. And at some point when I interviewed him, he said, like, what's the point of my having made all this sacrifice and made this journey and done this whole thing if my wife and children can't join me?
So we have a clip of this. I was just going to say, Ari met him, I think you were at a coffee house or something in Turkey, maybe, and Ari is being very transparent about what he wants to do and why he wants to do it. And he said, I'm not going to be able to pave the way for you. I'm not going to be able to make connections with you or help you in any way. I just want to tell your story. And so that's when he said, yes. Let's hear the clip. When Ari caught up with him again when he had made it to Germany. And
this is, I think, more than a year after. I think it's like a couple years after he had arrived in Germany.
Let's hear it.
And in the middle of class, did you jump up and shout? What happened?
Yeah. Exactly, that's what happened. Teacher...
News is, he's in a German class, and he gets word that his wife and children have been granted permission to come to Germany. And so he was in the middle of class when he got that information.
And in the middle of class, did you jump up and shout? What happened?
Yeah. Exactly, that's what happened. Teacher she said, "Oh, Mr. what happened?" I told her my family will come. She was very happy for me. Say congratulations. Baba.
Is that your daughter that you're talking to in the background there?
Yeah, they are here talking. She want to eat some cake.
So is that then what happens then? I mean, I have a feeling you like to stay in touch with your sources. What happens after that?
Yeah, I mean, that's the last time that we've spoken to him on the radio, but people every now and then will reach out who I haven't spoken to for 6 months or a year or 2 years. And I love being able to update listeners on their story and continue a narrative over time. One of the things that's so great about All Things Considered is that we can do short, medium, and long-term projects. And now, having hosted for 7 years, there's this entire history, this entire stable of people who we've spoken to before who we can sort of get back in touch with. One project that I started doing that's not related to Manzar Omar, but when we were just beginning to emerge from the pandemic recession, I came up with this idea that I called American Indicators, where we worked to find 4 different people in different parts of the country representing different parts of the economy. And the idea was to follow them over time as either the pandemic recession quickly ended or struggled along or bounced back and forth. And so there was a family that owned a small manufacturing facility in Georgia, and a woman who ran a food bank in Nevada, and a housing lawyer in St. Louis, and a hotel owner in, I think, Pennsylvania. And so we talked to each of the 4 of them over time, and we still go back and check in with some of them when there's news about, for example, the supplemental SNAP benefits for the pandemic were ending. And so we checked back in with the woman who owns the food bank in Nevada, who we've been talking to semi-regularly over the last few years. And we can say, now there's this big national policy that everybody's talking about. What does this mean for you on the ground in your community with the people you're serving? And I love being able to build those relationships with people, because so often what we do is short-lived, and it's these brief encounters, and they may be meaningful encounters, but there's something really satisfying about also being able to complement that with the longer-term storytelling.
When you left London and came back to the U.S., you vowed to take the same approach that you had to international issues or unfamiliar places. when you were reporting on America, and so that means like a more curious look than you otherwise might have had, a more attenuated look. I want to ask how you carried that through, and also a question from the audience, how you break through the tribalism that is dividing this country.
Yeah, so my goal was to approach the United States with the same curiosity and openness and wonder that I was approaching all of these countries I had never been to before over the previous 2 years. Because the United States is one country, but we contain multitudes. And there are so many fascinating things happening in this country if you pause to look at them. And as somebody who has spent the vast majority of his life in this country, I think I can kind of have blinders. I think all of us have some kinds of blinders. And I realized that that was one that I just kind of take for granted, that I know how to move through the United States in its different ways. And I wanted to try to take those blinders off. And I think one answer to breaking through the tribalism is that act of listening. You know, there are incredibly powerful forces in this country, whether they are political parties or corporations or social media algorithms, that want us to further entrench ourselves in our own self-reinforcing bubbles. And I think we don't have to learn a new skill. We just have to remind ourselves of the power of connection, of the power of listening, and hopefully, I mean, one of the threads that runs through this book is that whether I'm doing journalism for NPR or singing with Pink Martini or even doing this cabaret with Alan Cumming, what I'm trying to do is build bridges across these chasms of difference and remind people that people who might seem foreign are actually much more like us than we realize. And so, you know, my hope is that that's one theme that runs through all of these different stories.
Do you want to tell us what we were talking about in the green room about the gentleman in, was it Toledo?
Yeah. So I was doing a story about Syrian refugees in the United States, actually. And my producer, Matt Ozug, and I wanted to find somebody who thought there shouldn't be refugees allowed in. And so we went to this kind of working class bar near the auto plant in Toledo. And it was actually much harder to find somebody with that view than we expected, because Toledo had seen waves of immigrants over many generations. And so we found a lot of people who said things like, you know, my grandpa came from Czechoslovakia and they didn't think he was white, so... And then we found this one guy who was, I think, retired Air Force, and he gave us what I think was probably the closest we could find to an anti-refugee sentiment, where he basically said, if they want to come here and eat chicken wings and pepperoni pizza, that's fine with me, but if they want to wear a headscarf and speak their own language, they should stay where they are. I was like, all right, that counts as an anti-refugee sentiment. I'll take it, you know?
I can file my story and go back.
Yeah. And so, because it was the end of a very long day of reporting and we felt like we had what we needed, Matt and I just sat at the bar and ordered a beer. And then this guy, who had already had a few beers, kind of came stumbling up to us and he said, can I ask you a question? And I was like, of course, you answered my questions, I'll answer yours. And he said, you seem gay. Are you gay? And I said, yep. And he said, well, they throw people like you off buildings. Why would you want them here? And I paused. And it was funny because I didn't feel threatened. I didn't have like a fight or flight instinct. What I wanted to say was, well, you should see what they do to the gay Jews. And what I actually said was something like, well, you know, I know some gay Syrians and whatever. I don't know. People who are, not safe should have a place to be safe, whatever. I made up something. But the point is that he wasn't even exactly being homophobic per se. It felt like he was trying to build an alliance with me, as if to say, look, you're in a country that will even tolerate people like you. Why would you want to jeopardize that? And also, he wasn't invading my space. I was invading his. This was his bar where he hangs out. And I had the privilege to be there and to be able to talk to somebody like that. And the next day fly home to my comfortable bubble in Washington, D.C. with my husband and my dogs. I actually tried to write this into the book and couldn't quite figure out a way to make it make sense and be pithy, so I didn't. And it's probably not going to make sense and be pithy now. But I think of the way people talk about shark-infested waters, and it's like, no, it's not infested with sharks. Sharks belong in those waters. Like, we're the infestation. Like, we're the ones who are in their waters. So it's like, this was not like the bar was infested with working class people who hate refugees. No, it was their bar. It was infested with me. So I was just happy to be able to be there.
Did you use the first comment or the second one in your story?
Oh, that was off the record.
Oh, that was
we had
off
put
the
away our
okay.
we had put away our recording equipment, and also like the story wasn't about me. It wasn't about like my being gay and whether Syrian refugees would have opinions about me. Like, that's been one of the strange experiences of writing and now talking about this memoir, is that I've spent my whole life pointing the microphone at others, and in writing this memoir, I really had to turn back and write stories about myself, which I'm not accustomed to doing. And so that was a process. It was like discovering a new muscle group in an exercise routine I hadn't done before.
So that leads us to another question from the audience. How has being a member of the LGBTQ plus community influenced your journalistic practice? I do remember a line from the book where you said, basically something like, forgive the paraphrasing, but being gay there's a stamp on every one of my stories or interviews. Does that sound right?
I don't recall that line. It may be in the book. I think that there are two things I would say. One is that being part of a marginalized group, any marginalized group, I think allows you to see the scaffolding of society slightly more vividly than those who are not in marginalized groups. I also think all of us carry identity with us. And so I can talk about being Jewish and gay, but I can also talk about being cisgender or being American or being male or being white or being all of these other things that define my identity and define like the lenses through which I view the world as much as anyone else in this room. And so I think being part of a marginalized group helps you appreciate that there is no such thing as an absence of identity. And so the way being gay shapes my storytelling, I think, is not necessarily any more or less significance than the way being white shapes my storytelling. And so I write in the book about covering the war in Israel and sort of questioning the assumptions that I brought to the war as a Jew telling those stories. And then I sort of think, well, you know, if we bar people with lived experience from telling stories about that ecosystem, should we bar people of color from reporting on fights for racial justice? Should we bar women from reporting on the fight for reproductive rights? Should we bar taxpayers from reporting on changes to the tax code? And if so, who's going to report on proposed changes to the tax? But like, truly, we all pay taxes. And so when somebody is reporting on proposed changes to the tax code, I think you have every right to say, well, you know, are you a biased reporter because you pay taxes? Just as much as any of the other examples.
Mm-hmm. And this gets to the notion of impartiality and where you come from in stories and who should cover certain stories, as you said.
Yeah, and there's a push-pull here because I do believe in the idea of objectivity, but I also don't think there's such a thing as the view from nowhere. And so the question is, how do we bring our full selves, our identity, our history, our experience to the stories we tell and not ignore or negate that, while also trying to tell stories where any listener could put themselves in my shoes and understand what I'm viewing with my eyes and hearing with my ears, even if they aren't personally there to experience it.
In terms of questioning your own assumptions, and I think this is one of the best things that public radio does in terms of listeners, is it lets listeners question some of their own assumptions about stories. And you have, if you can give a condensed version of this, but a great story about a thumb drive when you were in Israel.
Yeah, so I got to Israel, and the first thing you have to do is go to the government office that gives you a foreign press credential. And they give you sort of the spiel, and you get your credential. And he also gave me this thumb drive. And he was like, this will have lots of useful information, maps, profiles of government officials, other stuff that will be helpful to you in your reporting. And I was like, I literally said to him, and the spyware is free? Because before we go to cover war zones, NPR sends us to hostile environment training where they teach you what to do if you're taken hostage and why not to put a thumb drive in your laptop that is given to you by a foreign government. So I was like, let's just slip that in my pocket and put it nowhere near my laptop. And then when I finished covering the war and went back to London, I thought, oh, well, this is going to be a great story. And so I got in touch with like the top cybersecurity company in the UK. And I said, I've got this thumb drive that the Israeli government gave me. I think it could be a really interesting story to see what's actually on it. So I gave it to them. And they did their, for free, because it was like for a story, you know, top of the line, many thousands of dollars if you're a paying customer, deep dive analysis of this thumb drive. And what was on it was maps, profiles of government officials, literally no spyware, which frankly I think is a crazy missed opportunity. Because like, I'm an American reporter, who are you going to give spyware to if not an American reporter covering,
Like, were you offended?
I was a little bit offended, yeah. I was like, you don't think I'm important enough to spy on?
I'll show you. All right, so with everything you have going on in your life, how on earth did you ever get involved with a group that you actually really were a fan of in the beginning, and now there are so many people who are fans of the group who are fans of yours for the reason that, you know, you sing with them, Pink Martini.
So they started when I was in high school, and I, as you say, was a big fan of theirs. And then they became sort of nationally known. And every time they would come to Washington, D.C., I would throw a brunch or a dinner or a cookout or something for them.
Can you explain who they are, by the way?
Yeah, so they're a little orchestra of more than a dozen people. And it's hard to describe the genre, but Thomas Lauderdale, the band leader, the pianist, likes to say, if the United Nations had a house band in 1962, it would be Pink Martini. So it's this very kind of like symphonic, romantic, global pop. We sing in dozens of languages.
You have to Google them if you haven't seen them. They're really great.
You know, I do 1 or 2 songs on each of the last 4 or 5 albums. But in 2008, I was just throwing a dinner party for them that turned into a late night sing-along around my piano. And then the next day, Thomas said, hey, Ari, I forgot you can sing. We're writing a song for the next album that we want a man to sing. Why don't you come and record it with us in Portland? And I, first of all, thought it was never going to happen. And then second of all, thought, well, if it does happen, it'll be like that one special time that I sang with this band that I'm such a fan of. So I went to Portland, I recorded it with them, and then Thomas said, well, we need to find a time for you to debut the song live with us. So why don't you come to the Hollywood Bowl? The band was playing 3 sold-out nights in front of 18,000 people each night. And the first time I ever sang with any band anywhere live on stage was at this iconic venue.
And you're looking at the pictures backstage.
Yeah, so backstage, before you like walk out onto that stage, you see these big framed black and white photographs of all of the icons who have performed there over the decades. So like, while you're waiting to go on, you're looking at images of Jimi Hendrix and Judy Garland and the Beatles and Aretha Franklin, all where you are about to stand. And then you literally walk in their footsteps and do what they did, but far worse.
Well, I think that for those people who are not familiar with your singing voice, if you would please give us a sample.
So, historically, typically, when I've done public radio events and people ask me to sing, I always say I like to protect the separation of church and state. Like, that's not what this is. But part of the purpose of the book is to kind of try to weave together the different strands of my life that feel very, you know, disparate from one another. And so I decided that, like, if asked to sing on book tour, the answer will be yes. And there's another aspect of my life that feels very sort of distinct from my public radio work, which is that, you know, when I'm hosting All Things Considered, it feels like the English language is a mansion with an infinite number of rooms that I get to explore. But there's one room that I'm not allowed to go in. And that is like red velvet rope, and behind it are all the 4-letter words. And when I'm on All Things Considered, I just have to like stand outside that room and gaze longingly in. But now, I
with
don't
that
have
warning.
to do that. So this is a song that was written by an American composer in 2010, and it carries a lot of meaning for me, and I hope it means something to you as well. I see you driving round town with the girl I love, and I'm like, fuck you. I guess the change in my pocket wasn't enough. I'm like, fuck you, and fuck her too. Said if I was richer, I'd still be with ya. Now ain't that some shit? And though there's pain in my chest, I still wish you the best with all together now. Fuck you. It just occurred to me. I hope you weren't planning on broadcasting this on WBUR.
It is on tape, I should tell you that.
You might have to deploy the bleep a few times.
Yeah. I have to say that was not the song that I expected you would sing. But
I like to keep people on their toes.
yes, exactly.
I did this comedy cabaret recently at the Kennedy Center with some incredible performers who actually make a living doing that, and I was a little bit out of my depth, but the pianist who was sort of the curator orchestrating the whole thing was the person who music directs the show I do with Alan Cumming and is so brilliantly talented. His name is Henry Kapersky. And so I had the concept of doing this, and I was like, Henry, can you give me CeeLo Green's Fuck You, but make it like an earnest Josh Groban ballad with accompaniment in the style of early Pasek and Paul musicals? And he was like, yeah, I can do that. And so that's what we did.
So,
Are you still collecting yourself?
yeah. So aside from, being able to say the words that you can't say on the air, what part of you, I wish I could sing a note. My longtime partner, who's no longer with us, used to say that when I was singing a song, I used to like to use all the keys because there was never one key.
Terry Gross has said more or less the same thing.
Really?
Terry has said that she wishes she could carry a tune.
Yeah. Well, it's not working for me, but for you.
You have other gifts, Lisa.
Oh, thanks, Ari. But I wonder for you, like what this does for you, and if there are times when you're really tired of radio that you think, well, I'm getting different yayas out here.
There's a form of connection that comes through radio broadcast journalism, but it's different from people in a room sharing an experience who will never be in that room together again, ever having that experience again. I think radio is so intimate and can be really personal in that way, but there's something electrifying about the collective experience of being in a room where people are making live music, whether you're the one making the music or the one consuming it. It's almost a communion. All of the stories in this book are in one way or another about connection, but the kind of connection you feel when you can tell that an audience is with you or they're not, and you're exchanging energy with each other is really different from you and I doing an interview on NPR that maybe one person is hearing or maybe 1 million people are hearing, but for each of them it's an individual experience.
So at the end of the day, when you've had a really good show, some interviews that you really like or reports that you've done that air, what's the sense of satisfaction that's different from satisfaction of doing a really good show with Pink Martini or Alan Cumming?
Well, they're both very sort of like evanescent, but there's just an adrenaline spike with a live performance that there isn't with a radio broadcast, because a radio broadcast is so much more sort of personal, quiet, and to me, maybe at this point, it just feels a little less terrifying. There's something about, like, even after all these years performing with Pink Martini, I still occasionally forget my lyrics. Especially there's one song in Arabic where, and now we've recently been doing it half in Arabic, half in Spanish, which is really a mind fuck. Now that we've opened the F-bomb can of worms, there's no going back, sorry. But so there's something about it's like walking the tightrope and will you fall? And there's a certain quality of that to anchoring like election night or some live rolling special coverage. But generally speaking, it's more like, I don't know, Susan Stamberg always used to compare it to hosting a dinner party. Yeah.
Question from the audience. You have a beautiful voice.
Thank you,
Did this play
audience.
into your pursuit of a career as a radio journalist, and have you considered TV?
My voice did not play into my consideration of a career as a radio journalist, but I do think that having sort of grown up singing and taking voice lessons, it helped me learn how to breathe from my diaphragm and how to use my voice, like the full range of my voice. Like, there are things about speaking and singing that are similar. And so I realize now that some of those skills that I built in my youth do serve me as a radio journalist. But I think the biggest criteria for being a good NPR host or being a good correspondent is journalism-based, not voice-based. And have I considered TV over the years? Sure. But ultimately, there are very few jobs where I can both spend weeks traveling through Senegal, Morocco, and Spain reporting on the connection between climate change, global migration, and rising political far-right parties, and also talk to an up-and-coming pop star I love about their new album that I'm really excited to share with listeners. Like, that is a really unusual combination that outside of hosting All Things Considered, I just don't know that many places you can do that range of things. I love that in my job, I know when I wake up in the morning that I am going to, over the course of that day, learn about something and go to sleep with knowledge that I didn't have when I started the day. That's my favorite thing about hosting All Things Considered. And there just aren't that many jobs in TV, radio, or anywhere else that give you that range to explore your curiosity.
Yeah, and without sounding like we're fundraising, I mean, really, you know that if you're going to be doing, that'll be coming up this week, by the way. You're counting on every one of you.
Thank you all for supporting your public radio station. Sustainer.
Yay, thank you. But you know, a story from, you go to Morocco and file a story for 4.5 minutes for TV, if that would, you know, if you were doing commercial.
And one of the things that I'm really proud of that we were able to do with that specific project I'm referencing is that having really spent more than a year preparing, when we did the project, we produced radio pieces, Instagram stories, podcast episodes, deep dive, immersive sort of data analytics, experiential. It's called scrolly telling. I learned the word that you scroll and it tells the story through mostly images. And so we found a way with this reporting project to really try to use every platform to tell the story to different, distinct but overlapping audiences.
Question from the audience. If your book was turned into a musical, what song or songs would you sing on the soundtrack?
Well, what a great question. Well, there, you know, I've actually been thinking about this because, no, I haven't been thinking about songs and musical, but like, I've learned more about the publishing process over the course of this experience than I ever had any idea I didn't know. And one of the things is the question of like IP, like what becomes of this book, if anything. And I've been thinking about how like, there's actually many different genres within the book. So like there's a chapter about my London producer, Rich Preston, which I really wanted to feel like a buddy movie, like a silly comedy. And then there's the few chapters about war, which obviously have a whole vibe of their own. I think the Pink Martini chapter sort of has like an almost famous quality to it. And so I like to think there are a lot of different sort of genres within the book, but the one thing that every musical has is the I Wish song, whether it's like, you know, The Little Mermaid singing Part of Your World or Into the Woods, a literal I Wish. And there's definitely an I Wish chapter in here, so take your pick of the I Wish songs, I guess.
For those who haven't read the book, your own I Wish now with all that you've done is what?
Well, one of the things that I've learned from Alan is continuing to challenge yourself, take risks, and try things you might fail at even after you've achieved what you wanted to within one space. Like Alan at
This
the
is
age
Alan
of
Cumming.
57. Sorry, Alan Cumming. We're on a first name basis. Alan Cumming, at the age of 57, created a solo dance piece based on the life of the Scottish poet Robert Burns. He's not a dancer. He had never done a dance piece before, and at risk of failure and injury, he did actually break a toe in his second to last performance. I saw his last performance, which he did with a broken toe. You know, he tried something that was dangerous and scary and new and risk of failure. And I want to keep doing that. I kind of felt that way about writing a book. And now that I've written the book, we'll see what the next thing is.
Wow, I just wish you the best of luck, Ari. I'm so glad that you say yes to Alan Cumming, to Pink Martini, to taking All Things Considered, the London job, and doing what you're doing. And I just have one other question, because we can sneak this in before you have to leave. If you had a chance to interview anyone in the world, living or dead, that you haven't already, who would it be?
I have never been able to answer that question. I am so sorry to end on a note of disappointment. But the great thing about hosting All Things Considered is that I actually do get to interview many of my heroes, many of the people I think are most interesting in the world. And ultimately, the interviews that I remember most, that I talk about in this book, that I talk about with my husband or around the dinner table, are not with the President of the United States or the biggest movie star. They're with the people who I didn't even know had fascinating stories to tell, who I just feel so lucky not only to be able to encounter and talk to myself, but also to elevate their stories and share them with all of you. And the reason I gasped for a moment was that there's something I like to do in every city where I've had a stop on the book tour, and until now I've always remembered to bring my phone up on stage to do it, but I left my phone in my bag, which I handed...
Candace is going to be...
Okay, because I think you all have copies of the book, right? Okay, what I would love to do, if you don't mind, Lisa, is turn our backs to the audience and take a selfie with all of you holding up your books. But you don't have to hold it up just yet, because here comes my... Oh, I could use Allie's. Here comes my bag. Okay, this is my moment of rebellion, because I work for a company that, as you may know, is known for tote bags. If there's one thing public radio knows how to do, it's make a tote bag. And I've been doing this entire book tour, although I have dozens of public radio tote bags at home. I've been doing this entire book tour with a tote bag from Monocle. Betraying the mothership, carrying a tote bag of the opponent. But if you'll indulge me.
So how are we preparing for this?
Okay. Let everybody hold up your books.
Okay. Oh, wait, you're going to...
Come on in.
Okay, I'm going down like this, too.
1, 2, 3.
Oh,
Perfect.
That is great. Wow. Well done. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you so much for coming.